I still remember the exact shape of the moment before it happened, the moment before my mouth opened, before sound became real, before a thought became something that could not be taken back. There was a sentence sitting behind my teeth, fully formed, waiting like a held breath. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt plain, necessary, almost boring in how obvious it was, and that was part of the terror. The warning wasn't poetic. It wasn't brave. It was simply true. I could feel it pressing forward each time someone paused, each time the air in the room shifted, each time silence stretched long enough for a person to choose either honesty or comfort. My mind kept rehearsing the words like a prayer I didn't believe in. Just say it. Just say it now. You don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to accuse anyone. You don't need to be certain of the ending. You only need to admit what you already see. But certainty was the trap. You never get to be certain when it matters. You only get a sense. A weight in the stomach. A fine, steady alarm that doesn't ring, only vibrates. It's not loud enough for anyone else to hear, but it's loud enough to make you feel sick. I knew what the sentence would do the instant it left me. It would turn every face toward mine, not with curiosity, but with calculation. The kind of attention that measures you. The kind that asks, without words, what are you trying to be? The kind that makes you realize you've lived safely because you've learned to be forgettable. I tried to tell myself it was only fear of embarrassment, the childish dread of saying something foolish, of being wrong, of being corrected in front of others. But it wasn't that. It was fear of being remembered, because some kinds of truth don't land like information. They land like accusation, even when you don't mean them that. You can offer a warning gently, and it will still be heard as defiance. You can speak quietly, and it will still feel to them like you raised your voice. And once you are seen as someone who interrupts the flow, someone who introduces doubt into a room that depends on certainty, you don't get to return to being harmless. I could already imagine the smallest reactions. Not outrage, something colder, a pause that lasts half a second too long, a look that lingers, a mouth tightening as if tasting something unpleasant, a hand making a casual note of nothing. People don't always punish you immediately. Sometimes they simply place you somewhere in their minds, and from that day forward, you are treated as a different kind of person. A risk, a complication. In war, though I didn't call it that in my head at the time, you learn quickly that survival isn't only about keeping your body intact. It's about staying inside the lines that keep you employed, fed, sheltered, included. It's about knowing when to become invisible. I had practiced invisibility for so long it felt like my natural state. I had learned how to listen without reacting, how to nod at the right moments, how to hold my posture steady when something inside me wanted to recoil, how to let other people's confidence wash over me like weather. And now that same training turned against me. Because the sentence behind my teeth wasn't a burst of emotion. It was a simple observation, a small interruption, a short step sideways from the path everyone else had decided to walk. And the problem with stepping sideways is that it makes everyone else aware they're moving forward. My body knew this before my mind admitted it. My throat tightened each time the moment approached. I kept swallowing as if I could push the words down into my stomach and digest them. My hands stayed still, but I felt something restless under the skin, like an animal trapped in a crate. When I think back, I can't even say I was afraid of death in that instant. I was afraid of consequence. The slow kind, the administrative kind, the human kind. I was afraid of being pulled aside later, not violently, but politely, of being asked questions with calm voices and blank eyes, of being told softly that I was being reassigned, of watching doors close without anyone ever having to slam them. And beneath that was an uglier fear I hate admitting. I was afraid that no one would care what I said, that I would speak, and it would change nothing, that the sentence would fall into the air and disappear, and I would be left exposed for nothing, standing there with my doubt visible, my obedience broken, and nothing gained except the knowledge that I had made myself a target. My mind kept offering compromises. Wait one more minute. Let someone else say it first. Bring it up later, privately, when it won't embarrass anyone. Ask a question instead of making a statement. Maybe you're misunderstanding. Maybe you're wrong. The easiest lie was the one that sounded responsible. You don't have enough information. But I had enough. I had enough to feel the weight. I had enough to hear the quiet wrongness underneath the confident words around me. I had enough to know that once the thing began moving, it would keep moving even if everyone regretted it. The moment arrived the way it always does. Not with a dramatic hush, but with ordinary timing. A gap. A breath. A natural place for someone to speak. I felt my chest expand. I felt the sentence rise. And then, like turning a key in a lock, I made a choice so small it didn't feel like a choice at all. I stayed silent. Silence, once chosen, has a way of rearranging the world around it. After that first decision not to speak, Everything seemed to settle into its familiar rhythm, as if nothing unusual had occurred. The room continued to function the way it always had. Voices moved in their accustomed patterns. Authority flowed downward. Obedience flowed back up, and no one appeared to notice the weight I was now carrying alone. The structure we lived inside did not announce itself. It didn't need to. It was present in the way people stood when certain figures entered, in how conversations shifted without being redirected, in how questions softened as they rose through the chain and hardened as they came back down. You could feel the hierarchy in your posture before you ever thought about it consciously. Your body learned who mattered long before your mind put names to it. Days were organized by routine, and routine was a form of protection. When everything followed an expected order, you didn't have to think about why things were done a certain way. You only had to do them. That was the unspoken bargain. Certainty in exchange for compliance. Doubt had no designated place in the schedule. I occupied a position close enough to hear what mattered, but far enough away to be expendable, close enough to notice inconsistencies, far enough that my observations would never be requested. I was present for discussions that shaped outcomes, but only as furniture, useful, replaceable, and expected to remain still. No one ever told me to keep quiet. That was the genius of it. The system didn't rely on threats spoken aloud. It relied on memory, on examples, on the quiet knowledge of what happened to those who made themselves inconvenient. You learned those lessons the way you learn a language, not through instruction, but through immersion. A person who used to be present stops appearing. A name is mentioned less often. An assignment changes without explanation. A tone cools. No one says this is punishment. No one has to. Authority, in that environment, wasn't cruel. It was efficient. It had no interest in cruelty required emotion, and emotion complicated. Efficiency only required order. The people above me spoke with confidence that felt rehearsed. Not because they were dishonest, but because hesitation was treated as weakness. Uncertainty was something you processed privately, if at all. Once a decision entered the shared space, it was expected to arrive fully armored. When doubts did surface, they were handled carefully, redirected, reframed, absorbed into language that made them sound smaller, temporary, irrelevant. I watched this happen over and over. A concern would be voiced cautiously, dressed as a clarification. It would be acknowledged politely, then set aside with a phrase that sounded reasonable enough to end the discussion. No one argued. No one raised their voice. The system didn't need conflict to assert itself. It only needed momentum, and momentum was sacred. Every structure we operated under was built to keep things moving forward. Delays were treated as dangers in themselves. Questions slowed things down. Warnings introduced friction. Friction suggested weakness. Weakness invited scrutiny. I understood instinctively that my silence had not gone unnoticed in the abstract sense. Silence was expected. It was participation in its own way. By not speaking, I had confirmed my role. I had reassured everyone, without words, that I understood where I stood. That reassurance was valuable. Once you offer it, people relax around you. They stop monitoring you as closely. You are safe again. Predictable. I told myself this was simply professionalism. That emotional restraint was necessary. That decisions of this scale could not be burdened by every private anxiety. That someone else, someone with more authority, more information, more responsibility, would speak if speaking were required. That belief was reinforced constantly by the environment itself. The higher up the chain you looked, the more composed everything appeared. Calm voices, steady hands, an absence of visible doubt. It created the impression that any fear you felt was evidence of your own limited perspective, and so the hierarchy didn't just suppress speech, it reshaped perception. I began to question my own instincts, not because they had changed, but because they stood alone. No one around me echoed them openly. That isolation made them feel less solid, less trustworthy. A thought shared becomes real. A thought kept private begins to dissolve under scrutiny. Each day followed the next with the same patterns. Orders arrived. They were received. They were acknowledged. They moved onward, untouched by hesitation. The machinery of it all was almost soothing in its precision. There was comfort in knowing your part, however small. Yet beneath that comfort was a quiet understanding. Once the machinery engaged fully, it would not stop to ask whether it should have started. I watched others who occupied positions similar to mine. Most had perfected the art of attentiveness without commentary. They listened closely, took mental notes, and said nothing unless directly addressed. When they did speak, it was to clarify logistics, not intent. Method, not meaning. That distinction mattered. Meaning was dangerous. Meaning implied interpretation. Interpretation implied judgment. Judgment belonged to those above us. Our role was execution and support, not evaluation. The more I absorbed this, the easier my earlier silence became to justify. It began to feel less like a failure and more like an adherence to order. I wasn't refusing responsibility. I was respecting boundaries. I wasn't afraid. I was disciplined. At least, that was the version of the story that allowed me to function. Still, the environment pressed in on me in ways I couldn't fully ignore. Conversations carried an undercurrent of inevitability. Plans were spoken of as if they had already succeeded, as if voicing confidence could substitute for caution. Language smoothed over rough edges, turning risks into assumptions and assumptions into facts. I noticed how often phrases were repeated, how certain ideas became fixed simply through repetition. The more they were said aloud, the less room there was to challenge them. Sound hardened into reality, and every time those ideas passed through the room, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, that quiet internal resistance that had nowhere to go. I understood then why speaking felt dangerous, not because of immediate punishment, but because it would disrupt a delicate equilibrium. It would force acknowledgement of uncertainty into a system designed to eliminate it. It would ask people to pause when they had already committed to motion. Pauses were unacceptable. To pause was to suggest doubt. To suggest doubt was to threaten cohesion. And cohesion, we were told without being told, mattered more than individual insight. So the hierarchy did what it was built to do. It narrowed the range of acceptable expression until silence felt like the only reasonable option, until obedience felt indistinguishable from survival. By the time the pressure returned, by the time my unspoken warning began to surface again, I was already surrounded by reasons not to voice it. Not dramatic reasons, practical ones, human ones. I had learned, fully, what it meant to belong. And belonging, I realized, came at a price that would soon be due. After that, the conflict stopped being something that appeared suddenly. It became constant, a low, steady presence that followed me through routine tasks, through conversations that sounded ordinary on the surface, through moments when my attention was supposed to be elsewhere. The warning no longer felt like a sentence waiting to be spoken. It felt like a pressure that never fully released. I began to replay the same internal argument over and over, as if repetition might change the conclusion. Each time, it followed the same shape. First came certainty, not dramatic, not absolute, but firm enough to be uncomfortable. A recognition that something ahead did not align with the confidence surrounding it, that the assumptions being made required too much faith and not enough examination. That momentum was replacing judgment. Then came doubt, not about the situation, but about myself. What if I'm wrong? That question carried real weight. It wasn't false humility. It was a genuine fear of misreading things, of mistaking anxiety for insight, of projecting my own unease onto a process larger than my understanding. I reminded myself how limited my view was, how many details were beyond my reach, how often people mistake partial information for the whole truth. I told myself that those above me had access to perspectives I could not see, that they had considered variables I wasn't even aware of. That belief was comforting. It allowed me to step back from the responsibility my instincts were trying to place on me. But the certainty never disappeared. It waited patiently, returning whenever the environment went quiet enough for thought. I imagined what it would sound like if I spoke, the tone of my own voice, the way I would have to choose my words carefully, stripping them of emotion so they wouldn't sound like accusation. I rehearsed versions that sounded calm, professional, reasonable. Each version ended the same way, a pause, not the kind that invites dialogue, the kind that signals something has gone wrong. I pictured the faces around me, not angry, but closed, measuring, deciding whether my words were worth addressing or simply worth remembering. I imagined responses that didn't argue with me directly, responses that acknowledged my concern while subtly removing it from consideration. Language designed to diffuse without engaging. We'll take that into account. That's already been considered. At this point, it's too late to adjust. Each imagined reply carried the same message. Your contribution has changed nothing, but your position has. That thought terrified me more than open reprimand would. I told myself that timing mattered, that even the right warning, delivered at the wrong moment, could do harm, that introducing doubt too late could create confusion without preventing disaster, that perhaps silence was the more responsible option now. That rationalization was powerful. It made hesitation feel like restraint, and restraint feel like maturity. I also imagined what would happen afterward, after the room emptied, after decisions were finalized. I imagined someone approaching me quietly, not to thank me, but to ask why I thought it was appropriate to question something that had already been set in motion. I imagined trying to explain myself without sounding defensive, without revealing how uncertain I truly was. without admitting that my concern was based on a feeling I couldn't fully prove. And I imagined failing to convince them, failing to justify myself, failing to protect the fragile position I occupied. That fear settled deep. It was easier to live with the discomfort of silence than the exposure of being wrong out loud. Yet there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when the warning surged back with force, when something someone said aligned too closely with my fear, when a plan was described in a way that confirmed the risk I sensed rather than easing it. In those moments, my body reacted before my mind could intervene. My breath caught, my pulse quickened, my attention narrowed to the sound of my own thoughts. This is it. This is when you say something, and then I would feel the weight of every previous silence pressing down on that instant. The realization that speaking now would not be a single act, but a break in a pattern I had already established. That it would raise questions not just about the decision at hand, but about why I was speaking now, after having been quiet before. Consistency mattered. Silence had made me consistent. Breaking it felt dangerous. I began to notice how easily the mind adapts when avoidance becomes habitual. The warning didn't vanish, but I learned to dull it, to file it away temporarily, to tell myself I would revisit it later, when conditions were safer. Later never arrived. Instead, I constructed explanations that allowed me to continue functioning. I told myself that responsibility was shared, and therefore diluted, that no single voice could carry the burden of what might happen, that if the risk were truly unacceptable, someone with authority would intervene. I told myself that systems exist to catch errors, that redundancy would compensate for oversight, that my silence was a small thing in a large machine. These thoughts didn't feel like lies at the time. They felt reasonable, necessary. Still, at night, when routine loosened its grip, the conflict returned with clarity that daylight rarely allowed. In the quiet, the warning sharpened again. The absence of distraction made it harder to ignore. I would replay the moment I first felt it, the initial recognition that something was wrong. I would examine it from different angles, searching for flaws, for exaggeration, for emotional bias. Each time, I reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. Even if I was wrong in detail, I was not wrong in direction. That knowledge sat with me heavily, not as panic, but as obligation. And yet, obligation alone was not enough to overcome fear. Fear of consequence, fear of isolation, fear of becoming visible in the wrong way. The conflict wasn't dramatic, it wasn't heroic. It was mundane and exhausting. A slow erosion of certainty through repetition and a constant negotiation between conscience and self-preservation. I didn't decide, not yet. But with each moment I remained silent, the space in which speech felt possible grew smaller, and the weight of what I wasn't saying grew heavier. The moment arrived without ceremony. There was no dramatic signal, no raised voices, no sharp intake of breath that announced its importance. It came the way irreversible things often do, quietly, nested inside normal procedure, disguised as just another step moving forward. Someone spoke, not hurriedly, not aggressively. The words were delivered with the calm assurance of something already settled, a conclusion stated as if it were the natural result of careful thought, not the end of a narrowing set of options. I felt it immediately, that internal shift, the subtle tightening that told me the path had just been fixed in place, that what followed would no longer be flexible, no longer open to reconsideration. The kind of decision that doesn't feel reckless because it is wrapped in confidence. The sentence behind my teeth returned with sudden clarity, shorter now, stripped of nuance, reduced to its essential warning. This was the moment it belonged to. My body reacted before my mind could fully enter. My breath changed, not sharply, just enough that I noticed it. My chest felt heavier, as if gravity had increased slightly around my ribs. My jaw tightened without conscious effort, muscles bracing for a movement that didn't come. I remember thinking how easy it would be, not emotionally, mechanically. A slight lean forward, a clearing of the throat, a quiet interjection that didn't even need to interrupt any. I didn't have to challenge the decision outright. I didn't have to accuse anyone of error. I could have framed it as uncertainty, as a request for clarification, as concern for alignment. I had rehearsed this. I knew exactly how to make it sound reasonable, and that knowledge terrified me, because it meant there were no more excuses left, no more uncertainty about how to speak, only the question of whether I was willing to accept what would follow. Time behaved strangely in that moment. It didn't slow dramatically, it compressed. Everything felt closer together, the voices, the air, the weight of expectation. The space in which speech could exist shrank rapidly. I could feel eyes moving, not toward me specifically, but across the room in a way that signaled closure. The subtle shift from discussion to execution, The invisible line being crossed where reconsideration stops being appropriate. If I spoke now, I wouldn't be contributing to a conversation. I would be disrupting a conclusion. That distinction mattered more than I wanted it to. My thoughts fractured. One part of me was still focused on the warning itself, on the outcome I feared, on the quiet logic that told me this choice carried consequences no one was naming aloud. Another part of me was already imagining the aftermath of my intervention. Not catastrophe, not punishment, something colder. I imagined the room responding with polite restraint, the way people do when they've already decided something and don't appreciate being slowed down. I imagined my words being received as an inconvenience rather than a contribution. I imagined the decision standing anyway, and then I imagined what it would feel like to sit there afterward, exposed, marked as the one who hesitated when others moved forward, the one who complicated things without changing them. That image rooted me in place. I told myself I was being pragmatic, that the warning, even if voiced, would arrive too late to matter, that the structure around us was already committed, already leaning forward with too much weight to stop. I told myself that speaking now might create confusion without preventing harm, that doubt introduced at the wrong moment could fracture coordination, that restraint could still be framed as responsibility. These thoughts didn't come as a neat sequence. They overlapped, collided, competed for space in the narrow window where action was still possible. My heart beat harder. Not fast, just forceful. Each beat felt like a question being asked and not answered. The room waited, though no one was consciously waiting for me. That was the cruelty of it. The opportunity existed, but it was unclaimed, unassigned, entirely optional. Silence was still acceptable. I felt my tongue press lightly against my teeth, the first physical movement toward speech. It stopped there, hovered, suspended. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when I understood exactly what I was doing. I was choosing safety over responsibility, not because I didn't care, not because I was indifferent, but because I cared about my position, my future, my ability to remain unseen more than I cared about introducing uncertainty into a system that punished it. That realization didn't arrive with shame. It arrived with clarity. I let my tongue relax, let my jaw loosen, let the breath I had been holding escape slowly through my nose, controlled, silent. No one noticed. The decision continued unfolding exactly as it would have if I had never been there at all. Words flowed forward. Agreement followed. The path ahead solidified with each sentence, each nod, each quiet confirmation. I felt something inside me close. Not snap, not break, close. Like a door pulled gently shut and locked from the inside. The physical sensation surprised me. A dull pressure behind my sternum. A warmth in my face that I hoped no one could see. My hands remained steady, but they felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. I stayed still. I stayed composed. I stayed silent. In that moment, silence stopped being an absence of action. It became the action itself. And once it was done, once the opportunity passed, once the room moved fully beyond the point where interruption was possible, I knew something had changed permanently. Not in the plan. In me. I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Not because speaking would never be possible again, but because the moment when it mattered most had been surrendered willingly. I had been present. I had understood. And I had chosen not to speak. The silence settled around me, heavy and complete, and I knew it would follow me long after this moment ended. The confirmation did not arrive all at once. There was no single moment where everything collapsed in a way that forced acknowledgement. What came instead was a sequence of small recognition, spaced far enough apart that denial could survive between them. At first, nothing seemed different. The routines held. Messages moved along familiar channels. Reports arrived on time, written in the same neutral language, carrying the same confident tone. If you skimmed them, you could believe everything was unfolding exactly as intended. But I stopped skimming. I read every line more carefully than before, not because I expected to find disaster spelled out, but because I was looking for absence, for the things that weren't said, for the gaps where reassurance should have been. The warning I hadn't voiced began to echo quietly in everything I read. Small deviations appeared first. Not failures, irregularities. Delays explained away by circumstances. Adjustments framed as refinements. Each one, on its own, was unremarkable. Together, they traced the outline of the outcome I had feared. I felt it each time I recognized a familiar pattern turning wrong. Not panic, something colder. Recognition. I began to notice how language shifted when things no longer aligned with expectations. Certainty softened into conditional phrasing. Confidence gave way to careful optimism. Words that once sounded final now carried subtle disclaimers. as if preparing the ground for disappointment. No one said mistake. No one said error. Those words did not belong to the system. They implied ownership. Instead, responsibility dissolved into process. Outcomes were attributed to complexity, to variables, to factors beyond control. The machinery adjusted itself rhetorically, even as its momentum carried it further along the path I had once hoped to interrupt. Each confirmation felt personal, even though none of it was about me. That was the strangest part. No one ever looked at me differently. No one accused me. No one praised me. My silence protected me exactly as I had expected it to. I remained inside the structure, unremarkable and intact, and yet I felt increasingly exposed. Every time a new complication emerged, I felt it settle somewhere behind my ribs, adding weight. I would hear it described in calm voices, framed as manageable, and my mind would return to that earlier moment, the one where a few words might have introduced friction when friction still mattered. I began to understand that consequences don't always announce themselves as consequences. Sometimes they arrive disguised as developments, as updates, as the natural evolution of a plan that no longer fits reality. Time stretched. What I had feared didn't happen immediately. That delay almost convinced me I had been wrong after all. Almost. But when the deeper confirmation came quietly, not as chaos, as inevitability, a realization embedded in routine language, a subtle shift in emphasis, a recognition, shared indirectly, that the situation now required containment rather than progress, mitigation rather than success. I remember the moment clearly, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't denied anymore. The risk I had sensed early on was now being managed as a fact. No one spoke my unspoken warning aloud. No one traced the line back to its origin. The system absorbed the outcome without reflection, the way it absorbed everything else. For everyone else, this was adjustment. For me, it was confirmation. I felt it in my body before my mind caught up. A heaviness in my limbs, a tightening in my throat that had nothing to do with fear now. Fear had passed. What replaced it was something harder to escape. Certainty. Not certainty about the past, that was already settled, but certainty about my own role in what had unfolded. I had not caused it. That thought arrived instinctively, defensive, and immediately felt insufficient. I had not caused it, but I had recognized it. I had seen the shape of it forming while it was still possible to disturb. I had understood enough to feel responsible, even if responsibility was never assigned to me formally. That distinction mattered. I continued performing my duties. I continued speaking when spoken to. I continued maintaining the appearance of alignment. On the surface, nothing had changed. Internally, everything had. Every update felt like a quiet accusation, even though none was intended. Every careful rephrasing sounded like an echo of the words I had chosen not to say. Every attempt to stabilize the situation reminded me that prevention had once been an option. What hurt most was not the scale of what unfolded, but the banality of it, the way it became normalized, the way people adapted without pause, adjusting expectations and language, as if this outcome had always been part of the plan. There was no reckoning, no moment where silence was named. The system moved on, and I moved with it, carrying a knowledge that had nowhere to go. I understood then that consequences are not always measured in damage alone. Sometimes they are measured in what you must live with afterward, in the private accounting that never appears in any report. I watched the situation settle into its new shape, stabilized but diminished, and I knew with absolute clarity that my earlier fear had been accurate, not in every detail, but in its core truth. The path we had taken had always led here, and I had helped clear it by staying quiet. That realization did not come with drama. It arrived the way everything else had, quietly, and it stayed. Time did not soften it. I expected distance to dull the edges, to turn memory into something abstract, something I could examine without feeling it press back. That's what people say happens. That time reshapes experience into something manageable. It didn't. The memory didn't fade. It settled. It took on weight, like sediment at the bottom of still water. Not always visible, but always there, waiting to be disturbed. I carried it forward through changes in routine, through different rooms, different voices, different responsibilities. On the surface, my life continued to organize itself around new structures, new orders, new objectives, new patterns that demanded attention. But the silence came with me. It attached itself to moments of pause, to empty spaces between tasks, to the quiet just before sleep, when distraction loosened its hold and thought was no longer optional. That was when the moment returned most clearly. Not the aftermath, not the adjustments, not the consequences as others experienced them. The moment, the breath I held, the words that never crossed my lips, The precise instant when I chose not to be the person who interrupted. I replayed it endlessly, not because I believed I could change it, but because my mind seemed determined to understand it fully, as if complete understanding might lessen the burden. It didn't. Instead, I began to notice how that silence had altered something fundamental in me, not my beliefs, not my values, but my relationship to them. Before, conscience had felt like a guide, imperfect, sometimes inconvenient, but fundamentally trustworthy. Afterward, it felt more like an accusation that never spoke aloud. I had learned something about myself that I couldn't unlearn. I had learned that fear, when given the right conditions, could outweigh responsibility, not in theory, but in practice. That under enough pressure, I was capable of stepping aside and letting momentum decide for me. That knowledge didn't make me cruel. It made me smaller. I became more careful in ways that had nothing to do with safety, more deliberate about staying within acceptable boundaries, more skilled at sensing when to remain quiet. Outwardly, this looked like professionalism, like maturity, like experience. Internally, it felt like erosion. I noticed how easily silence came, how familiar it felt, how rarely my instincts now pushed forward with the same urgency. When they did, they carried a hesitation that hadn't been there before, a memory of what happened the last time they demanded action. Sometimes, I tried to justify myself again, tried to revisit the old arguments. You weren't responsible. You didn't have authority. It wouldn't have changed anything. Those explanations still existed. They were still technically true. But they no longer answered the question that mattered. Not what would have happened if I spoke, but who did I become when I didn't? That question had no resolution. I saw it reflected in smaller moments later on. Moments where speaking carried little risk, but still required a willingness to disrupt. I felt the hesitation rise again, familiar and immediate. The same calculation. The same instinct to preserve position over principle. I would catch myself and feel the old weight shift. The silence had trained me. I don't imagine myself as a villain in this memory. I don't see a coward trembling in a corner. I see someone ordinary, functioning within a system that rewarded restraint and punished friction. That is what makes it unbearable. There was no single dramatic failure to point to. No clear line where I could say this is where I went wrong and leave it there. The failure was subtle, internal, nearly invisible from the outside. It lived entirely in the space between what I knew and what I allowed to remain unsaid. Sometimes, I wonder if anyone else felt it, if others sensed the same warning and made the same calculation, if silence was shared, even if unspoken. But I never ask. That too is part of the war, whatever shape it took beyond me, ended or moved on or transformed into something else. Systems always do. History records outcome, dates, decisions. It does not record hesitation. It does not record the sentence that was never spoken. It does not record the moment when silence felt safer than truth. I do. I carry that record alone. And the thing I understand now, long after the moment has passed, long after any practical consequence could be altered, is that silence does not end when the opportunity to speak disappears. It continues. It reshapes memory. It reshapes identity. And it stays, long after everything else has moved on, as proof that when it mattered most, I chose not to be heard.